questions before we continue? We'd much rather this was more of a discussion, so please don't hesitate to do so. We talked a lot about Richard and his deformity. The way I dealt with it in the show is you'll notice there's a contemporary dressing room off stage left, audience right. And in our production, Richard goes to this dressing room to talk to the audience, but also to change disguises or to put on different characters that he's going to play. It's one of the ways I dealt with that dichotomy there. But in reality, Joan is very well learned on this. Why Shakespeare made him deformed is a pretty interesting topic. Maybe you could address that
and
a
in
little
fact,
bit.
There's even an article in BBC History's May issue, History Magazine's May issue, and the excuse me, the one of the reasons that he was deformed was to show an evil character through deformity, which was a 16th century construct. They looked at that people who were not whole spiritually would not be whole physically, so they deformed him to give him an evil character.
And there's also a lot of play about how Richard sort of played fast and loose with the law, when in actuality it was the complete opposite. He enacted some amazing laws. Well, we take them for granted now, but at the time, they could just drag you outside and cut your head off. So, would you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. In fact, one of the first things he did when he became king on June 26, 1483, prior to his coronation, was to enact laws to protect people, such as issuing bail, that you could not be held without charge. People were held for months and years without charge, that juries had to be qualified. Juries were dragged up off the streets and they got fed, so they weren't too anxious to come to any conclusion. They would just as soon see a trial drag out. And he also enacted title search, essentially title search, but properties were being sold over and over to, and people were left paying out money and not having any property. So he stopped that with his laws and other laws too. But I mean, those are really key things that the habeas corpus and being the bail and the juries were major, very forward thinking at the time.
So are we seeing Shakespeare's play today?
You are seeing Shakespeare's play, yes. And I came to the conclusion that I was going to do Shakespeare's play. I wasn't going to have any sort of, nice ghost of Richard commenting, although that might be a project I take up in the future. I just didn't think that was going to work. When you say you're doing Richard III, you kind of have to do Richard III. But as I say, I'm interested in the other Richard, which kind of had me thinking the whole time, why did Shakespeare do this? Why did he change the person? And are there little clues in the play as to why he did this?
He's a monster.
He's a monster. In fact, when I said I was doing this play, people said, you can't do that play. It's terrible. I said, well, it's Shakespeare, so it's all right. But people were really like, everybody wants to see a comedy these days. And I said, well, there's some comedy in Richard III. But yeah, it is a serious play, and I think it's also an interesting example of how one can really change public opinion.
Talk about spin.
Talk about spin. I mean, I want that propaganda machine working on my stuff, And it's amazing what Shakespeare did to this man's memory. So.
Well, but it certainly made it more interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and in some ways, Joan thanks him, right? Because we wouldn't maybe all be talking about Richard III.
In fact, he would probably be a lost footnote in some historical book because he was only king for a couple of years. And
you wonder, though, what he could have accomplished if he had remained, because he just, in those few years, he made those fundamental changes that are still with us today. So.
Yeah.
And in fact, some of the other things he did was he established citizens' councils, essentially, so that people could come to his property who did not have, peerage and power and representation, and they could, get his ear, so to speak, and find justice. That is a good question. He was buried in Leicester originally, and on the Greyfriars property, and they think they found where his remains might be. But a lot of things happened during the Reformation, and graves were destroyed, headstones were destroyed, so they're not entirely sure. Right now, where they think he is under a parking lot.
If they find his bones, can they positively identify them?
Yeah, well, they can identify, probably. They can identify that he could be Richard III, or that he can't possibly be. Because it turns out they found a descendant of one of Richard's sisters in Canada, and through the mitochondrial DNA, which doesn't change from female to female, or from female to male descendant, but they had to find a female descendancy. And they found this woman in Canada, so they know what his mitochondrial DNA probably looks like. Because it was his sister, and he would have inherited the same mitochondrial DNA as his sister did. And they can compare that to, if they find his remains and his DNA is intact, they can at least determine whether the mitochondrial DNA matches up. And if it does, then the chances are pretty good that that it is him. It's not 100%, but it's like 93% or so.
One of the fun things about Joan's books is that she combines science and fact with this fantastic imagination. But I read them. I read the first one, read it all night. I stayed up all night and just read it. She plays with time. I won't say too much. I don't want to spoil it for everybody. But I love playing with time in production. Shakespeare messed around with time all the time. He's got people who are supposed to be dead in this play, of course. But Joan, is that okay if I tell a little bit?
Yes, of course.
Brings Richard forward into this time and has this really interesting time travel thing. And the way she explains everything scientifically, from DNA to everything else, you just buy the whole thing. You're like, well, I could do that. So the books are a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Encourage them.
I did bring them. If you're interested, you can buy them. I did bring them, and I will sign them.